The Chernobyl nuclear disaster will forever be remembered as one of the biggest man-made disasters of all time. The impact of the meltdown on reactor number 4 at the plant is still being felt in the surrounding areas today, and it will be decades before the exclusion zone around the plant will become habitable again. Number 10. One of the most iconic images from the Chernobyl disaster, and something that has caused scientists a lot of concern, is a mass of molten metal that was given the moniker the elephant's foot. While it seems harmless judging by the name, the elephant's foot is actually one of the most dangerous objects on our planet, since spending just a few minutes close to it would almost certainly cost someone their life. It serves as a testament to the intensity and danger of the Chernobyl disaster. The heat generated during the meltdown was so intense that the reactor and fuel rods were turned into molten metal, and according to some people who were present, this metal could be seen flowing like lava. The result was a slurry of uranium, sand, and metal that hardened into a radioactive lump, and while many of these can be found throughout the site, the elephant's foot is by far the largest and the most dangerous for anyone to be around. Quite unbelievably, no one was aware of the elephant's foot until about 8 months after the plant had exploded, when scientists walked into a corridor beneath the reactor and saw it for the first time. It was named as such thanks to its resemblance to an actual elephant's foot, but it was only after taking some readings that they realized just how hazardous it was. They concluded that if anyone spent more than 5 minutes near it, they would have received a fatal dose of radiation and would not have long to live. But its exact potency was a mystery. When readings could eventually be taken, they showed that the lump was emitting 10,000 units of radiation every hour, an unbelievably dangerous amount. This mixture of materials is called corium, first discovered during the 3 Mile Island partial nuclear meltdown that took place in Pennsylvania in 1979. At the time, nothing could be done to remove the lump, and for years it sat in place as it was. But as time went by, it started to lose some of its potency, and eventually scientists and cleanup crews were able to start working on it. But it was tough going. Since the mixture was incredibly hard, it wasn't easy to take samples of the metal, and scientists had to resort to using assault firearms to break pieces off to be analyzed. According to some reports, a soldier attempted to break the 2-ton lump in half with an axe, but after many failed attempts, he had to give up with no results. He'd then been exposed to the leaking radiation for so long that he had to be evacuated from Chernobyl immediately. It was during this time that the iconic photo of the elephant's foot was taken by Artur Korneyev, the then deputy director of the New Safe Confinement Project. Rumors swirled that he'd passed away from radiation exposure shortly after the photo was taken, but this was found to be false as he continued to work at the site for 3 more years, helping in the removal of hazardous materials and determining which areas were safe for workers to enter. Eventually, the lump softened, and according to some scientists, they no longer needed extreme tools to break it apart, as it had taken on the consistency of sand. But it still remains under the reactor and is contained by the shelter structure that was built around the reactor to make it as safe as possible. It's believed that the foot will eventually decay, breaking up into barium and lead, but it'll take at least 100 years before the reactor becomes safely accessible again, and the elephant's foot will remain in place until then. Number 9. There is no doubt that the Chernobyl disaster has had adverse effects on the health of many people, not only those who were working on the plant at the time, but also residents of Pripyat and the city of Chernobyl itself. One of these effects is a condition known as Chernobyl heart, which was first discovered when a young man visited a hospital, complaining that he was feeling ill. When his medical history was checked, doctors realized that he came from the UK during the time of the Chernobyl meltdown and had a heart murmur. He underwent heart valve replacement surgery when it was discovered that he had valve disease, which caused the valves to calcify, and it was surmised that this was a direct result of radiation exposure from the disaster. Quite unbelievably, only 2 people lost their lives during the initial meltdown at the plant, but that number would rise exponentially over the years. 28 more people passed away in the next 3 months, and soon doctors started reporting an alarming rise in patients suffering from leukemia and genetic mutations. It had become clear that there would be serious long-term effects thanks to the disaster, and doctors started to fear for the well-being of children that were born after the fact. Not only had some of their parents been affected by radiation, but medical care was lacking in the area, and most people lived in poverty and didn't have access to a lot of food. The three main health dangers that were identified were cerebrovascular diseases that cause strokes, mental disorders, and cognitive impairment, such as dementia. Some children who were exposed to the radiation showed stunted growth, immune disorders, dental issues, and a high risk of developing thyroid cancer. Since the disaster, research has shown that there's been a 200% increase in birth defects in the area, a 25% increase in congenital birth problems, and in Belarus, 85% of the children born every year show signs of genetic mutation. As for Chernobyl heart, this describes children that were born after 1986 whose parents lived near Chernobyl at the time of the disaster, and who were born with one or more holes in their heart as a result. Fortunately, the condition is treatable, though specialized cardiac surgery and close monitoring are required. But not everyone in these areas can afford this, or even has access to these services. Military conflicts in the region also delay any available treatments, but many lives have been saved after the condition was identified. Unfortunately, more than 1 million children still live in areas around the planet where they're exposed to low levels of radiation, and are also affected by radiation that's present in their food, such as vegetables that are grown in radiation-contaminated soil. As a result, an organization called Chernobyl Children International was established in 1991 to aid the children who've been affected by the disaster. They help bring doctors to the area to perform life-saving surgeries, provide nursing to ill children, provide education through newly constructed community centers, and provide housing to families that have been displaced. Number 8. While the areas in and around the exclusion zone have been extensively analyzed and mapped for radiation, scientists report that they've come across some hotspots that are still very radioactive and, of course, dangerous. The disaster caused as many as 49,000 people to be displaced, as they had to be moved from affected areas in a 20-mile radius around the plant to nearby villages in Kiev that were not in danger from the leaking radiation. Though most people fled for their lives upon hearing about the meltdown, some chose to remain in the exclusion zone at their own risk, or in the years that followed, decided to return there in secret. In the immediate aftermath of the meltdown, scientists were tasked with mapping the radiation's distribution, and they were given handheld machines that they carried around with them, not only for safety, but to identify contaminated areas. It was later discovered that these units were incapable of reading the massive amounts of radiation that were present, and hence some extremely dangerous spots have never been identified as such. Furthermore, since decades have passed since the disaster, the environment around the plant has changed, which means that the initial maps that were created are now obsolete, and renewed efforts are being made to pinpoint undiscovered hotspots. Scientists who enter the exclusion zone typically carry dosimeters that warn them if they enter an area that contains radiation above acceptable levels. One of the areas that's known to still be highly radioactive has become known as the Red Forest, since the pine trees in that spot have turned red over time, and even the soil beneath the trees is said to be extremely dangerous. In 2019, a group of scientists traveled to the exclusion zone where they used a drone and radio-controlled fixed-wing aircraft to map such areas, one of which was an industrial scrapyard that's situated in the village of Kapachi. When compared to the Fukushima disaster, the still radioactive areas around Chernobyl are far more radioactive, and where nuclear meltdowns usually result in a uniform distribution of radiation, Chernobyl has been found to be an exception, since the small plane identified random pockets of high radiation that had never been identified before. This has caused a lot of concern, since some areas in the exclusion zone are now open to tourists, and some former residents who've moved back to the area will likely be unaware that these pockets exist, dramatically raising their chances of exposure. Strangely, some of the areas that were never included on the initial map were known to be radioactive, such as sites where contaminated vehicles were either washed, buried, or abandoned. The area causing the most concern, though, is a bowl-shaped clearing where rocks were separated from radioactive material following the meltdown. And for reasons unknown, this radioactive material was then left in that same spot, never to be touched again. In the years to come, further efforts will be made to not only identify hazardous areas, but to make the exclusion zone as safe as possible. But this cannot be done until all the hidden hotspots have been identified and correctly mapped. Number 7. Thanks to footage of the disaster and documentaries that have been released in the decades since, most of us are familiar with what the Chernobyl site looks like. It's since become a bucket list item for some tourists, but most people are still too cautious to ever set foot in the exclusion zone. What many people are not aware of, though, is the existence of Chernobyl 2, which is situated a short distance away from the plant, but hidden from view by the trees in the surrounding forest that started to reclaim the land thanks to the absence of humans. When it was first completed, the site was kept secret from the public, and on maps from the time, it's listed as a summer camp for children. But in reality, that couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the Chernobyl 2 building, which is now a husk of its former self, was being used during the Cold War as a research facility, where Soviet scientists worked on classified projects and secret technologies that were being developed at the time. While it would have been a very bad and likely fatal idea to approach this building during the Cold War, today it's guarded by just one man who is tasked with keeping unwanted visitors from entering. The building is still surrounded by a now rusting fence, and on its grounds, abandoned vehicles still sit where they were last parked, now being overrun with grass and other types of foliage that have somehow managed to not only survive these toxic conditions, but in some cases thrive. The main building's walls have started to crumble over the years since no maintenance has been carried out. The base is now almost unrecognizable compared to when it was fully staffed and operational. Strangely, it's impossible to compare the state of the building's control room nowadays to what it looked like before, since no photos were ever taken of it while it was being used. Back then, as many as 1,500 people worked at the base, most of whom also lived there while performing their duties. The area was constructed with entire families in mind, as there was once a kindergarten, apartments, and play areas, all of which have now fallen into disrepair. The main purpose of the base was to act as an early missile detection system that would inform military personnel if the US had launched a missile at the Soviet Union. The base covers an area roughly the size of a football field, but looks are deceiving, as it's actually much bigger than it seems. Beneath the building, a series of buildings were constructed, and here the military kept all of its computer equipment, radios, displays, and wiring away from the prying eyes of the public in the US. Many of these machines and equipment can still be seen at the site today, as they've been removed from the buildings and left out in the open, where the elements have rendered them inoperable and useless. People who have dared to venture inside report that the interior of the building is completely dark, since none of the light switches work anymore. The floors are littered with glass shards and electronic equipment that was abandoned in the mad scramble to evacuate the base following the meltdown. Number 6. Imagine if you were a shortwave radio enthusiast, and one day, while scanning through the frequencies, you come across a mysterious and unidentified sound that you can't explain. Imagine then that thousands of other people around the world also heard that same sound and were equally baffled by it. This may sound like something out of a science fiction movie, but it actually occurred between July of 1976 and December of 1989. And while the source of the sound has now been identified, its purpose is still shrouded in mystery. Ham radio enthusiasts who came across the sound reported that it was a very powerful signal, unlike anything they had heard before. They described it as a continuous tapping sound, and when they managed to triangulate its origins, they were taken aback to discover that it was emanating from somewhere inside the Soviet Union. Hence, it quickly became known as the Russian Woodpecker, thanks to the sound of the tapping, closely resembling the sound of a woodpecker beating its beak against the bark of a tree. Before long, the signal started having an effect on not just shortwave radios, but public radio broadcasts all over Europe. Radio stations would report that their broadcasts were being interrupted by the strange tapping sound. Residents of the Soviet Union started complaining that the sound could be heard on their television sets, and so higher-end TVs that were sold at that time included a woodpecker jamming device that was pre-installed. But it wasn't just interference with TV and radio stations. A short while after the sound was first heard, Airports started reporting that the signal was causing issues with their emergency frequencies, but at that point, nobody had any idea what was causing it. Unsurprisingly, this gave rise to several conspiracy theories all around the world, some being of the more ludicrous kind. Some people started suggesting that it was the result of a mind control experiment conducted by the Soviet military, while others suggested that it might have had something to do with experiments on the weather. As is usually the case when the Soviet Union was involved, many people were certain that it was some kind of secret signal or code that was being used by the Soviet spies during the Cold War, and the sounds were never meant to reach the ears of outsiders. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in December of 1991, it was finally revealed that the woodpecker sounds were coming from a radar system that was designed to warn the Soviet military of any incoming missile attacks, and that more than 1,500 military personnel and scientists were living in the area surrounding the radar that was causing the signal. Then, in 1989, the signal suddenly disappeared, leaving many people wondering whether the radar had been destroyed or whether it had simply fallen into disrepair. Today, conspiracy theories about the sound are still emerging, since the purpose of the tapping sound was never officially explained. The sound has never been heard again, though. Number 5. As soon as news of the Chernobyl disaster reached the outside world about 2 days after the first explosion occurred, there was understandably a lot of concern. But most people were unaware of the long-term implications that would come about. But one of the first rumors, and perhaps conspiracy theories that emerged following the accident, was that animals in the area had been badly affected by the radiation, and they'd started mutating in horrible and unnatural ways. This, of course, was later found to be nothing but a fabrication, but it isn't completely untrue. Scientists have made some surprising discoveries while studying the wildlife around Chernobyl, one of which is a frog that's managed to somehow adapt to its toxic surroundings. Many species on Earth, humans included, wouldn't last in dangerous areas in the exclusion zone for very long. The radiation would start affecting their health, and eventually they'd start suffering from radiation sickness that would lead to their lives being lost. In 2016, 2 Spanish scientists, Germán Orizola and Pablo Barraco, decided to visit the exclusion zone to conduct research on the animals that still choose to live there, in an effort to document the effects that the radiation has had on them in the 40 years that has passed since the disaster. On the very night that they spent in the exclusion zone, Orizola was walking around an area about 200 yards from the plant when he spotted something very strange. He was looking for one particular creature, a green tree frog that he knew lived in the area. Orizola and Barraco decided to study frogs in the area since they're known to be very sensitive to their surrounding environment. Not only is this particular frog species endangered, but it also breathes through its skin, which one would think would make it impossible for them to thrive near Chernobyl. Orizola couldn't locate any of the frogs, and instead he came across a similar-looking frog with one difference. It was black instead of green. At first, he thought he'd stumbled across a species that had never been seen before, but then the realization dawned on him. These were the same frogs that had somehow altered their skin, enabling them to survive in the exclusion zone. While it may seem that these frogs simply changed the color of their skin, the truth is far more complicated. The color change is merely a side effect of something far bigger, a protective response to the massive amounts of radiation in the area. The frogs only turned black over time, since they managed to raise the levels of melanin in their skin. This has afforded them even more protection against the toxic atmosphere and environment, allowing them to thrive rather than die out. Melanin has proven to reduce the damage that radiation does to living cells. It does this by dispersing the radiation's energy, and hence ensures that a lot less damage is inflicted on the cells. It is, however, not only the frogs that have adapted in this way. Under laboratory conditions, certain types of bacteria and fungi have shown similar responses when exposed to ultraviolet and ionizing radiation. The frogs have since been studied extensively, and remarkably, they were found to have suffered no ill effects from the radiation whatsoever. Their internal organs have suffered no damage, and other than adapting their skin, they've shown no signs of mutation. Number 4. When a massive disaster occurs in just about any country on the planet, the public is immediately informed and given instructions on what to do next. not only in an effort to save as many lives as possible, but to keep them informed of any developments that may occur. But when the Chernobyl disaster struck in April of 1986, this was simply not the case. The accident caused a plume of radioactive waste to be propelled as high as a mile into the air, which would have been visible to the residents of the nearby city of Pripyat. But for 2 days, most people were blissfully unaware that their lives were in danger. According to some sources, leaders at the Kremlin were made aware of the disaster just 90 minutes after the first explosion at Chernobyl took place, but they decided not to inform anyone for at least 48 hours. Since the Soviet Union had started heavily investing in nuclear power following the end of the Second World War, they felt that the disaster would be seen by the West as an unmitigated failure on their part, and to avoid embarrassment, they decided to keep quiet for as long as possible. While most people understand this flawed thinking, it doesn't explain why Russian leaders decided not to inform their own people, especially those living in nearby areas that would without a doubt be affected by the massive levels of leaking radiation. But their efforts at keeping the incident under wraps quickly fell apart when a portal monitor at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden started detecting alarmingly high levels of radiation. These levels were first noted by a chemist working at the Forsmark plant who was passing by a radiation monitor while on his way to start his shift at the station. He later stated that he had just finished his breakfast and brushed his teeth before heading to work, and as he walked by the monitor, an alarm started to sound. And when the Swedish National Defense Research Institute analyzed the cause, they found that the radiation wasn't being caused by a nuclear bomb, but by a nuclear accident. Workers at the plant started scrambling for an explanation, as they understandably assumed that the radiation was leaking from their own plant. The chimneys and most vulnerable areas were checked, but found to be operating as intended. It was then determined, after realizing that the radiation was present outside the plant, that Forsmark was not responsible for the spike in radiation, as other nuclear power plants started reporting the same findings. With this information at hand, the course of the radiation could be charted, and it was found to be emanating from the southeast, likely the Soviet Union, particularly near Kiev. Leaders around the world were notified, many of whom contacted the Kremlin for answers, and after 2 days of hiding it from the world, Soviet leaders were forced to admit that the Chernobyl power plant had suffered a meltdown and that it was an unmitigated disaster. In the years that followed, many people have described how their lives were forever changed by the disaster, many of whom felt that they could have avoided the resulting diseases and sicknesses had they been informed more quickly and just evacuated their houses. Number 3. Cancer is a disease that has claimed millions of lives over the years, and scientists are constantly looking for better ways to combat it. While chemotherapy has been found to be effective, it's a very strenuous practice that usually leaves the patient feeling exhausted, and it also has some adverse effects, such as hair loss, nausea, and mucositis, which affects the mouth and throat. While we now have a much better understanding of cancer and how to treat it, the treatments are not always successful. And in 2021 alone, as many as 10 million people passed away despite receiving treatment, and these numbers are only expected to rise in the years that follow. This means that a more effective treatment needs to be developed, and thanks to a series of discoveries made in Chernobyl's exclusion zone, this may indeed be possible. First, scientists discovered that wolves living in the area were thriving against all expectations. Hence, they were studied, and to everyone's surprise, it was found that they'd started developing anti-cancer genes that allowed them to live in the area without being affected by the remaining radiation. Then, a few years later, they discovered a species of microscopic worm called nematodes living in the area that, against all odds, also had been unaffected by the radiation that's still present in the soil in the exclusion zone. At first, it was assumed that they were living in safer areas, but this was quickly disproven. And now we know that they're simply incredibly resistant to radiation. And this has caused some excitement among scientists who were studying new ways to treat cancer patients. These worms have proven to be perfect for such studies, since they're known to have very simple genomes and reproduce incredibly quickly. Thus, if the radiation did affect them, they would perish very quickly, but this simply isn't the case. Since the worms reproduce so quickly, they evolve much faster than other species do. Since they produce dozens of generations in a single year, while other species, such as the wolves, which only produce 1 litter of pups every year, usually in the spring. Professor Matthew Rockman and Dr. Sofia Tintori started collaborating with the US and Ukrainian scientists and collected thousands of these worms from the soil and fruit in the exclusion zone. They collected samples of the Osseous tipuli worm from areas with high and low levels of radiation so that an accurate comparison could be made. And since this species had been used in other studies on evolution and genetics, the worms from these different areas were then compared to each other and worms from other parts of the world, and surprisingly, they were unable to detect any differences in the ones from Chernobyl and those that had never been exposed to radiation. This means that they are seemingly impervious to radiation, rather than having evolved to counter its effects. Scientists believe that this could help them identify who some people are who are more likely to suffer from the effects of carcinogens that are known to cause cancer. Number 2. It seems almost unthinkable that the Chernobyl disaster was the result of errors made by technicians during a routine power outage test, coupled with the fact that the plant's design had several flaws. Both these factors could have easily been avoided had the plant been constructed to international standards and had the technicians involved simply followed the training that they had received. So it comes as no surprise that the disaster was seen, in the eyes of the Soviet leaders, as a massive embarrassment, and that they even tried several different tactics to hide the leak from the rest of the world, and the US in particular. But it would come to light that this wasn't the first time that the Soviet Union tried to conceal issues at the plant from the rest of the world. Unsealed KGB documents have shed light on the years leading up to the disaster, and much of it does not make for pretty reading. In 1983, the Soviet government was told that the Chernobyl plant was one of the most dangerous on the planet, since it didn't have most of the safety equipment needed, and used at other plants in other countries, and even other regions of the USSR. This lack of equipment would also later be a contributing factor in the Chernobyl meltdown, but at the time the information was kept secret from the public and the world as a whole. Residents of Pripyat and other villages close to the plant were blissfully unaware that they were living in an area where a nuclear disaster could occur at any moment, and the government had no intention of divulging this information. As mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union only admitted that the meltdown had occurred 48 hours after the first explosion, but their deception went even deeper than that. When Swedish scientists contacted the Kremlin about radioactive particles that were detected around the world, Soviet leaders refused any aid, stating that the radiation situation at the plant had been brought under control and that there was no real danger to workers or members of the public. They added that the affected reactors had been placed in industrial reserve, which meant that they'd been completely and successfully shut down, and that they were no longer a threat, which was of course far from the truth. Unfortunately, there was no way for the rest of the world to ascertain whether this really was the case, and the governments of the world had no choice but to take the Soviet Union's word for it. But when they held a meeting with the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agency on the 25th of August, 1986, almost exactly 4 months after the disaster, they finally admitted just how bad the situation of the plant was. And at last, the international community could aid in coming up with a plan to make the area safer. Had this information been shared months earlier, a lot of leaked radiation could have been contained, and the impact on the surrounding environment would have been far less damaging. It would later be discovered that this information was withheld under strict instructions that were formalized on a note that was later found in the KGB archives. It stated that no information on the, quote, radiation situation at the plant was to be discussed with anyone or to be published in the media. Employees were also forbidden from discussing any contamination that had occurred, the work that was being done to curb the contamination, and the extent of contamination to the region's water and food supply. The release of this memo caused outrage, since this information could have saved countless lives, but instead the Soviet government decided to rather remain silent to avoid international embarrassment, but only managed to delay it by a few months. Number 1. Working in a nuclear power plant is certainly not a job that the average person could or would want to do. While staff members are usually extensively trained and have the applicable credentials to carry out this work, there's always the chance that something could go catastrophically wrong, as is evidenced by the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters. but it must be far more unnerving in an area that's been contaminated after a nuclear meltdown, since it isn't easy to figure out which areas are safe and which are extremely hazardous. Even all these decades after the disaster, new areas are still being identified that are inaccessible to humans, since spending such a short time there could result in their deaths from radiation poisoning. In the aftermath of the disaster, a massive amount of nuclear material ended up buried in the plant's reactor hall, where it still remains today. Today, the hall is covered with a shield called the New Safe Confinement, a movable steel structure that's helping contain the remnants of the melted reactor, preventing more radiation from leaking into the atmosphere. But scientists have made an alarming discovery beneath the shield, as they became aware that the new fission reactions are taking place thanks to the uranium fuel that's buried in the plant's debris. New studies are now being conducted to figure out whether these fission reactions will simply fade away, or whether more serious efforts should be made to contain them, in case they lead to yet another disaster that could affect the entire planet. The problem here is that no one is able to enter the specific room where the neutrons are streaming. Their presence is a sure indication that fission is occurring inside the room, and according to sensors that have been placed in the area, they show no signs of abating just yet. Anatoly Doroshenko, a scientist from the Institute of Safety Problems of Nuclear Power Plants, reported that the neutron count inside the plant is still readily rising, but rising slowly enough to ensure that a few more years will pass before another disaster, if one is even imminent. This comes amid talks for the reactor to be dismantled, but with this new information now coming to light, it seems certain that this will not be a possibility for many years, or likely decades to come. It's also been revealed that the fission reactions were likely sped up only after the shield was installed around the plant. Due to its construction, it allowed rainwater to enter the plant, specifically the hull containing these hazardous materials, and since water is known to enhance the chances of neurons hitting and splitting uranium nuclei, it's believed to be a contributing factor. Gadolinium nitrate is usually used to diffuse these types of reactions, and sprinklers containing the solution have been installed at the plant, but these are unable to reach some of the deeper lying areas that have now been shown to contain fission reactions. The main concern is that as the rainwater subsides in the plant, these reactions will only speed up, and if this is the case, another disaster will be unavoidable. While it will not be as powerful of an explosion as the original disaster, it may cause other parts of the plant to collapse, exposing the core once more, and causing further damage to the environment. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.